In the last video, we went ahead and made this mold. So we took this plastic container here and used it as a form to create this plaster mold here. Using this plaster mold, we could then pour in slip and slip cast a pot and create pots like this. This one here, I just pulled out of the mold and is starting to set up. I think this is a great first mold to make. However, there's a few things I'd like to try and improve. The first one is the rim of the pot, the lip here. You can see there's a bit of an angle. That is all from the way the slip is absorbed into the plaster. So we pour the slip into the mold will suck out the water, but that also means the volume of the slip goes down. Let me show you that on another pot as well. So here is another mold. It's very similar. It's a one-piece mold, and it creates a pot like this. We kind of have this weird lip. So even though the mold itself is completely smooth, we wind up with this texture on the inside and this little bit of a slant. So as I mentioned, that happens because the level of the slip goes down. So here's what that looks like in time lapse. So as the slip goes down, there is less slip at the top to go ahead and form the top of the pot right here. And this slant here is actually the slip going down during that time I was slip casting it. In my case, it was about half an hour. So the slip dropped about that far. That's okay. If you don't mind manually cleaning up your pots like that, it's fine. However, one of the reasons I really enjoy slip casting is that I can let the molds do a lot of the work for me. So what I'd really like to do is figure out how to create a mold where I need less cleanup of the rim of the pot. So it turns out there's a relatively straightforward solution to that. And the answer is to make a well for the slip to sit in. So this here at the bottom is where the pot is. And then everything above that is where extra slip can sit. So as the water is absorbed from the slip and the level drops, it never drops below the rim of the pot. So I can slip cast, and then all these weird things that are happening at the top, I just trim around this flat area here and pull that away and then release the pot. So I have a nice clean edge for the pots that I create. So one of the things we want to do in this video is figure out how to add this well onto our forms. The other thing we want to do is try and get a better surface finish. If you look up close, there's a bit of a rough surface. Part of this was features from the plastic that transferred over, but all this stuff here around the edge, these are actually from the mold that we created. If you look down inside the mold, there's all these little gray specks. Those are actually bubbles that got caught in the plaster as it set, and slip has crept into them, and that's leaving the rough surface finish. You can see it on my other mold as well. So this one's a little bit easier to see into, it's wider, so all these little gray specks are bubbles that have formed. And you can see the bottom of the pot, how it kind of leaves this rough surface finish. These are relatively easy to clean up. Part of the reason I want to do slip casting is to have the molds do the work for me. Bubbles in plaster, I think, is actually a rather tough thing to solve, but we'll take another step in that direction in this video as well. One of the other things about the bubbles in the molds is they will get worse over time. So as you use the mold more, the bubbles will erode a little bit more and become larger. It can also create a texture where the slip cast pot wants to hold on to the plaster mold, and it can be harder to release. So there are other reasons to try and address these bubbles besides just the surface finish. It can make the process easier. So how are we going to address these problems? For the lip, I already showed you the solution. The idea is that we need to extend our form up so that we have this area for the slip to sit in. So what we need to do is add a little bit to the top that's wider that will form the well that the slip can sit in. So we need to somehow modify this form. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to turn things upside down. All the bubbles will want to try and float in general. The plaster is pretty thick, so they won't move around a lot, but if they're going to move it in any direction, it will be up. So if instead of pouring the plaster from the top down, what if we turn things over and pour the plaster this way? So now any bubbles would want to try and rise to this surface, and they would hopefully stay away from this surface here. And this one here. There won't be this big area on the bottom to catch the bubbles, and they can all just kind of rise out. So more specifically, we'll take our form and we'll put it down in the inside, just like that. And then hopefully all the bubbles will float up. However, getting back to our slip well idea, we're going to run out of space very quickly. We might be able to get it in here, I'm not sure. Our diameter is going to get bigger so that we can have this area. So let's go ahead and figure out how we can add onto this form and see if we can use this bucket, or we're going to try and need something bigger. How are we going to modify this form here to add our slip well? I'm going to use this pink foam here. This can be gotten relatively cheap. It's pretty easy to carve, and I think we can attach it onto the edge here. Potentially you could use several different things. I have used 3D printed objects before to extend a form, or potentially you can make it out of cardboard. This is where your arts and crafts skills can shine. But I think I have used this foam in the past, and I think it will work relatively well. So what we're going to do is cut this out into a circle for our slip well and then attach the two together. Off camera, I did just that. So here's a circle. There's actually a taper to it. So we have our draft angle, and it is maybe an inch bigger, a couple centimeters bigger than the edge of our form. So we'll have our pot form, and then we'll have this bigger area where the slip can sit. And so as the slip drains, we won't impact the pot itself. So we need to go ahead and secure these together. To do that, I'm going to use some silicone caulking here. Let's go put a bead around the top. All right, so we'll just go ahead and attach that down. I'm going to go ahead and rub my finger around and make that all nice and smooth. We want to make sure we have a really good seal here, that it's all the way around. That way we don't have any plaster leaking out. The other thing is this is going to want to float, and so we don't want it to separate from the foam. You also want to be careful not to get any silicone on the plastic here, because that would then impact the mold that we're trying to make. It would show up in the plaster. So next, we need to think about what we're going to put this in. And if we did it this way, we might be able to fit in our other bucket. I don't know. But as I said, we want to do this upside down, so any of the bubbles will raise and they won't have any surface to catch on. And our bucket is definitely not big enough for that. Our taper angles are working against us. So the bucket's flared out like this, and our pot upside down is flared like that. So we have this V shape. So we need something that's actually wider in the bottom, but if we had that, we wouldn't be able to get the plaster out. I guess we could potentially do an upside down bucket. Even then, it's not big enough. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how to pour plaster through that. And there's a big hole in the bottom. So what are we gonna do about that? Well, so the next step in kind of the evolution of making molds is to go into a custom form to hold the plaster. And those are called cottle boards. So here is my set of cottle boards. They're basically a piece of wood that is smooth on one side. This is an old IKEA piece of furniture, so it's got that kind of plasticky laminate on the outside. And I've screwed a piece of wood. This is a 2x4 chunk onto the side. The idea is we can put these around the outside to catch the plaster. So we put one here and put one here. This one will go past the edge. We can put a clamp back here, and that'll be one side, and we can keep going around. There's another one. We put a clamp here, and the final one. And since these can slide past each other, we can actually adjust the size to be just right. So we make it a little bit smaller, we can get it centered. We'll need to seal all this up. We don't want any leaks out the bottom or out any of the sides. Of course, right now I'm just holding these in place. In a minute, I'll go ahead and put the clamps on and show you how to do it for real. All right, so that's how we can get a form big enough for this mold. However, in my last video, I just went ahead and made a mold of this form, so I'm gonna make a different mold. So off camera, I went ahead and did this one. So this here on top is a plastic planter. I went ahead and took a thin piece of plastic and put it over the holes that were in the bottom. And then just like you saw me do, I went ahead and silicoted it down to a piece of foam. Again, this foam has a taper. So we have a nice draft angle. I actually have a hole in this one, so I get my hand in here, get all the caulk in, but that probably isn't required. And same thing, we'll go ahead and build a structure around this with cottle boards. And I think I'll need to get the plaster pretty close to the top to have it be tall enough. And then finally, I don't really want to do this on my bench, so I'm going to get a piece of wood to put down that I can get all the plaster on. All right, so here is an old piece of plywood that I've had laying around in my garage for a while. We're going to repurpose it for the mold. Now I want to go ahead and affix this to my bottom of my mold, this piece of wood here. To do that, I'm going to use some more silicone. So I'm going to put a pretty hefty bead all the way around. There's one. I'm going to do a second one. There we go. All right, and then I'm going to stick this down. I think we'll put it right here. And squish it down. Make sure that silicone adheres. Potentially I could ball up clay and stick it down, but I really want this to not float. So this here is an empty cavity. So it's going to have a bunch of air in it when the plaster's around it, so it's going to want to float. So here are my clamps. Got those all on, so now I want to go ahead and scooch it in. All right, there we go. The cottle boards are all in place. They're all snugged down. And I've got maybe 3/4 of an inch on the narrow sides. So off camera, I went ahead and secured my cottle boards. I also went ahead and cut these foam pieces here just to fill up some of the corners a little bit. That'll make my plaster mold a little bit more roundish and take up a little bit of volume. This is going to be a lot of plaster. I also went ahead and used silicone and siliconed everything down. My last time I did a big plaster pour, it was a plaster disaster, so I'm going to be overzealous in my preparation. Silicone might be a little bit overkill, but I had it and it was open, so I might as well use it. All the silicone has set up, and while it was doing so, I also took some of my foil tape and prepped the rest of the mold here. I basically went over all the seams, just being doubly sure that I'm not going to get any plaster leaking. I also went ahead and did some rough math to get the volume of this space here, and I measured out the corresponding amount of plaster. As a quick recap, either calculate or measure the volume of the space you want to fill with plaster in milliliters. For every milliliter of volume you need to fill with plaster, you need 1 gram of dry powder plaster, and you need 0.7 grams of water, or 0.7 milliliters. To make the math easy, so imagine you need 10 liters of plaster to fill it up. You would then need 10 kilograms of dry plaster and 7 kilograms of water. The water to plaster ratio is 70 to 100. Go back to my previous video, it has more details on measuring out and mixing up the plaster. I'm going to mix this up in 2 batches, I think, because I don't have a bucket big enough. It's going to take that much plaster to fill up. So here is my wet, all of my water, and I have the corresponding dry plaster here. I'm going to go ahead and put this in and start letting it slake. Okay, this should be the first half of my plaster. This is going to slake for 3.5 minutes. Right now we mix for 4. Now we're going to pour in a little bit, see if it leaks. Hopefully not. Try and miss the form. Take a look. No leaks so far. All right, there we go. Now I'll rinse this out really quick and we'll mix up the second half of the plaster and pour it on top. Somewhat counterintuitively, mixing up more plaster is easier, at least for the mixing part, because the bucket's taller. The mixing paddle is less likely to suck air down in and create a vortex. So if you're mixing smaller amounts of plaster, a narrower and taller container is good. And so far, we don't have any leaks, so our belt and suspenders worked. That is the silicone and the foil tape, and the mold's still stuck down. And I didn't show it this time, but just like in my last video, I used Murphy's soap as a mold release on my pot form. So this is starting to set a little bit already, but we should be good still. And to get the bottom, I'm going to need to fill this basically all the way to the top. That's about as full as I can get it. This will take about half an hour to kick from the very beginning to the end. So we'll come back to it once it has set and do the demolding. It's been about 45 minutes since I finished pouring the plaster. It is damp and starting to cool. I'm going to demold this in 2 steps. First, I'm going to take the cottle boards off the outside, break it free from this piece of wood on the bottom. That way I can shape the outside edges. There's a lot of plaster here, and if I can remove some of the weight at this point, that'll be good. I'm going to leave the pot on the inside for a little while longer. There are all the clamps. Since we taped and siliconed this together, all the cottle boards are still in place. We'll probably have to pry a little bit. There we go. That side's off. Looking pretty good. All right, there's all the cottle boards. Next, let's see if we can get it to release from this board here. It is very stuck down. There we go. So there is our well. It popped out, which is fine. And I see a couple of little bubbles here. but so far it looks way better than my last one. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm going to leave the pot in here for a while longer. This edge here might chip, and I want the plaster to set a little bit more, but the outside I want to go ahead and clean up while it's still pretty soft. Nice thing about using the foam and the tape on the corners is that my edges are already kind of rounded off. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and sand this a little bit more and make it all smooth. I think for my purposes, it is good enough. I'm gonna go ahead and let this sit and cure for a while longer, and then we will try and pop out the form from the inside. And in the meantime, I will clean up some of this mess. The plaster has been curing for another hour, hour and a half more. Let's see if we can go ahead and demold it now. Now we find out the importance of our mold release agent and our draft angles. I am a little worried this pot's pretty up and down, that maybe it's grabbed onto the side. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and go straight to air to see if I can get this release. No, that came relatively easy. Pull it out. All right, there's our mold. I can definitely see a line where we did the two different plaster pours, so that's not ideal. I don't feel any surface differences, so we'll see. It also looks like I got some chip out around the very top. My guess is that some of the plaster got over the top of this, so it created an undercut. So when I pulled it off, it broke the plaster out. However, it's not too bad. It is way better than the rim I had before. And at first look, I don't see any real bubbles in this, which is awesome. As you recall, we were trying to get rid of bubbles in the mold and trying to create a slip well so we can get a better rim. And I think we did both of these. The slip well looks pretty good. This rim here might require a bit of touch up, but not too bad. And as far as bubbles, the only ones I see are up here in the slip well. I don't see any down in the mold itself, which is awesome. Time will tell. All right, at this point, it's the same as the last mold. I'll go ahead and let it finish drying. This mold is big, so it may take a few days, my time. But right now, I'll show you the dry mold and slip casting a pot. Turns out this mold took more than a few days to dry. It actually took the better part of a week. But it is finally dry. So here it is. I've gone ahead and sponged it all down so there isn't any loose plaster on it. And I've got my slip here all mixed up and ready to go. Let's go ahead and slip cast a pot in this new mold. And let's see if our improvements actually worked. So the idea is we'll just go ahead and pour our slip in, fill it all the way up. This will be the rim of our pot, but we want to fill the slip well too. That way we have extra headroom for the slip. And I'll just dump it in. Out to the top. And the slip well. So what's happening now is the plaster is going to start sucking the water out of the slip. That will form the pot against the walls. We'll need to let this sit for a while, and it's really a guess as to how long. This mold is actually dry now, and it's the first time using it, so I really don't know how long it'll take. Usually with my plaster and the molds that I make, I usually give it about half an hour. So I'm going to do that, and we will see. All right, I think our slip has been sitting for long enough. The level of slip is definitely draining down into our slip well, which is great, just what we wanted. Now it's time to dump this out. This thing is big and heavy, so I'm going to go right for my slip bucket and do this off camera. All right, there we go. There's the pot. There's still a little bit of slip down in here, so I'm going to turn this over my table here and let it drain for a while and let the slip go ahead and firm up. Heavy. All the slip has drained. Flip it back over. Let's go ahead and trim it so I can get the part where I spilled. This is where the slip well really comes into its own. So I know there's a shelf right here, so I can basically cut straight down to that and over. Take all that off, put it into my reclaim. All right, and there's the pot. So we got a nice pot that's formed. It's not very thick, but my pots tend not to be. And it's probably released from the mold itself. However, going around trimming it, I usually push the pot against the wall again. So I usually just take my fingers and slightly release it. Now the real trick is going to be flipping this out and pulling out the pot. I'm going to try and pick it up and palm the pot out and drop it on this wearboard here. This mold is big and heavy though. There we go. There is our brand new pot, and it looks really good. I can see a very faint line, I think, where we had the layers of different plaster. It's a little bit more obvious on this side, but it's very faint. I suspect by the time this dries, you would not see that at all. Relative to my last mold, I actually cleaned up the foot here better, so that's cool. I have an old version of this that I've done a while ago, so remaking it was really nice, and I was able to fix some of the flaws in that mold. All right, this is still super soft, so I don't really want to handle it, or I wouldn't normally handle at this point, but I want to show you the rim. So there's a little bit of flash here at the top where we trimmed, but overall it's much more uniform. That's compared to the other one-piece mold that we just made. Because there is no slip well, we wind up with a really funky rim. I really like these much better. So looking at this a little bit more, I'm pretty sure this piece here, where I have this little bit of extra flash, is where the rim chipped out on my original mold. Again, it's very minor. It's pretty easy to clean up once this thing goes leather hard, but it is something we'll have to deal with. It's definitely something to be mindful in making these molds. And then the other thing we were fighting was bubbles, and I don't see any. So a bubble would be a void in the plaster, so that would create a protrusion on the surface here, and I don't see any. I see one small defect here. There's a little bit of a line right there. Somehow I got a scratch, I guess. Or maybe there was just something in my original mold. But I am very, very happy with the surface finish of this. So it's definitely more effort doing this compared to our previous mold. You have to go and modify the form like I showed you for the slip well. And then you have to pour the plaster upside down, which means finding something to hold the plaster. And building the cobbleboard structure is kind of non-trivial. And this resulting mold is huge. So in comparison, here's the previous one I did. This one I cast right side up, and so I have a lot of bubbles in the surface. So that was definitely annoying, but this mold is much smaller, much lighter. In future videos, we'll go ahead and look at solving this problem. We want to be able to pour the plaster upside down, but we actually want to have something much more conforming around our shape. So that way we don't wind up all this extra plaster. In the meantime, this mold should work great for me. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.